I've been colorblind my whole life. Not fully. I see most colors fine. It's a specific deficit, a narrow band in the violet to purple range that my eyes just don't process correctly. Everything in that spectrum reads as gray to me. My optometrist explained it when I was 8 using a chart with dots, and I remember thinking the chart looked perfectly normal, and not understanding what everyone else was seeing. It's never been a significant problem. I don't drive vehicles that use purple signal lights. I don't work in fields where color coding in that range matters. I fill out the medical disclosure form at the start of every posting and move on. I've been a field medic for 9 years across 4 different stations. The job is the same everywhere. People come in hurt or sick, I help them, they leave. The species changes. The injuries don't much. Broken things, infected things, things that need to be cleaned and closed and monitored. I'm good at it because I pay attention and because I don't make assumptions about who deserves more careful treatment than who else. Varon Station was my 6th posting. Mid-range facility, good equipment, understaffed in the way all field stations are understaffed. I'd been there 3 weeks when she walked in. She came in the afternoon, which is the slow part of the day. The morning rush of overnight cases had cleared and the evening wave hadn't started yet. I was restocking the supply cabinet, which I do myself because the inventory system is optimistic about what sufficient means, and thinking about whether the commissary would still have the soup that wasn't terrible by the time my shift ended. She had a cut on her left forearm. Clean edges, moderate depth, the kind you get from something sharp and stationary rather than something moving. 5 people came in with her and stood by the entrance, which I registered as a lot of companions for a minor injury but not unusual. Some species don't travel in small groups. I brought her to a station and started cleaning the wound. She watched me work without speaking, which is also not unusual. I asked if it hurt. She said it did not. I said good, it would take about 10 minutes. She said nothing. I thought about the soup. The cut was straightforward. Clean it, close it, dress it, done. I've treated the same injury 1,000 times on a dozen different species and the procedure doesn't change much. The biology varies but the principle is the same. You remove contamination, you support closure, you protect while it heals. She had good pain tolerance. I noted this the way I note everything about patients, not as a judgment, just as information. Some species have higher baseline thresholds, some individuals within species do. She watched my hands work with the focused attention of someone who finds the process interesting rather than someone who is nervous about it. You've had stitches before, I said. Not a question, the way she held still was practiced. Yes, she said. Recent? Several years ago. A pause. A different kind of injury. I didn't ask what kind. People tell you what they want to tell you and the rest isn't your business unless it affects treatment. The door opened while I was finishing the dressing. Another woman came in, smaller, moving quickly, the particular efficient movement of someone who manages things for other people. She stopped when she saw my patient and said something in Valain that my translation module rendered as approximately *, everything is arranged. We can proceed when you are ready. *. My patient responded without looking up. The other woman stepped back toward the entrance and stood there. I finished the dressing and gave the standard instructions: keep it clean, don't submerge it, come back if it shows signs of infection. The healing timeline for Valain biology in this type of wound is approximately 8 to 12 days. She listened to all of it. Then I looked at the woman by the entrance. She was standing with her weight slightly shifted to one side, the way people stand when they've been on their feet too long and are trying not to show it. There were shadows under her eyes. She had the specific stillness of someone who has learned to take up as little space as possible. Are you all right? I said to her. She looked startled. Actually startled, a small physical flinch, like the question had come from an unexpected direction. I'm fine, she said in standard. Automatic, the way fine always is when it isn't. You look tired, I said. Do you want to sit down? I have a chair. Another flinch. Smaller this time. I don't, She glanced at my patient. I'm waiting. I know, I said. You can wait sitting down. The chair's right there. She sat. Like she wasn't sure she was allowed to, but did it anyway, carefully, like the chair might be a trick. I turned back to my patient to give her the wound care instructions in written form, which I do for all patients because people remember about 40% of verbal instructions and the written version fills the gap. My patient was looking at me with an expression I couldn't read, not the watchful attention from earlier, something else. Evaluating something. Is she with you? I said, meaning the woman by the door. Yes, my patient said. She should rest if she needs to. That's what the chair is for. My patient said nothing for a moment. Then, she won't rest if she thinks it's not permitted. It's permitted, I said. Tell her. A pause. Something moved across my patient's face that I didn't have a name for. I'll tell her, she said. I gave her the written instructions, reminded her about the follow-up timeline, and she left with her 5 companions. The woman from the door walked out behind her, and I noticed she was moving slightly more upright than when she'd come in. Maybe I was reading into it. I probably was. The afternoon continued. 2 more patients, either complicated. I finished restocking the supply cabinet. The commissary did still have the soup. The diplomatic incident notification came the next morning. It arrived through the station's official communication channel with enough formal headers that I knew before I opened it that someone was unhappy. The summary was that my treatment of a senior diplomatic visitor had been characterized as deliberately disrespectful, that I had displayed preferential attention toward a lower status individual in a manner consistent with calculated political provocation, and that a formal response was requested. I read it 3 times. Then I read it a 4th time because I thought I might be misunderstanding something. The representative came in person an hour later, a formal Villain official, the kind who moves like every step is a statement. He explained, with the careful phrasing of someone who has rehearsed this, that the patient I had treated was not, as I had apparently assumed, an ordinary visitor. He described her status. He described what her clothing indicated about that status. He used the word P twice. I sat with that for a moment. I have a color vision deficiency, I said. Specific to the violet-purple range. Her clothing appeared gray to me. I had no indication that she was. I stopped. I treated her the same way I treat everyone. The representative looked at me. The woman you offered a chair to looked tired, I said. So I offered her a chair. A longer silence. You genuinely did not know, he said. Less a question than something he was processing. I genuinely did not know, I said. He left without resolving anything formally, which I was starting to recognize as a pattern in diplomatic interactions. They leave when they need to reconsider something, and coming back counts as losing. I went back to work. I had 4 patients that afternoon, and I thought about the situation intermittently between them, in the way you think about something you can't do anything about, turning it over, not finding a different answer, putting it down again. The thing I kept coming back to wasn't the misunderstanding. It was the woman by the door. The way she'd flinched when I asked if she was all right. The specific quality of someone who has learned to expect that they won't be asked. I didn't know anything about her. I didn't know her name, or her role, or how long she'd been doing whatever she did. I knew she looked tired and that she'd sat down carefully, like sitting was something that required permission. That was enough to make me think about it. I wrote up my patient notes, filed the formal response to the diplomatic notification, accurate, factual, including the medical disclosure about my color vision that I file at every posting, and locked up the supply cabinet. The soup was still good. I thought, probably nothing comes of this. I was wrong about that. She came back 8 days later. I know it was 8 days because I'd been tracking the wound healing timeline in my notes, standard practice for any case that might require follow-up, and 8 days put her at the midpoint of the expected recovery window. It was a reasonable time to return for a check. That's what I told myself when she walked in with her 5 companions, and I felt something shift in how the room was arranged, The same way a room shifts when a specific person enters it, and everyone else adjusts without being asked. The wound was healing correctly. I examined it, confirmed the closure was holding, changed the dressing. She watched my hands again with the same quality of attention as before. "It looks good," I said. "Another week and you won't need the dressing." "I see," she said. "Any pain?" "No." "Itching?" "Some. That's normal at this stage. Don't scratch it." "I know," she said. "You told me." I had told her. She'd read the written instructions too, I suspected, because she answered my follow-up questions before I finished asking them, which is what people do when they've actually read the documentation. The woman, Vela, I'd learned her name from the station's diplomatic registry when I looked up the formal notification, was standing by the entrance again. Same position. Same careful stillness. This time she looked less tired. Marginally. The kind of difference you'd only notice if you'd been paying attention the first time, which I apparently had. I finished the dressing and was writing up the follow-up notes when my patient said, "The formal notification." "Yes," I said without looking up. "You filed the response." "Standard procedure when there's a formal complaint," I said. I documented the medical disclosure and the factual account of the treatment. "You included the color vision deficiency." "It was relevant," I said. "It explained the misunderstanding." "Yes," she said. "It did. We were talking about paperwork. We were also talking about something else, and I was aware of it but couldn't have said precisely what." "Did it resolve the matter?" I said. "Formally," she said. "And informally?" A pause. "Informally it raised a different question." I looked up from the notes. She was watching me with the evaluating expression I'd seen at the end of the first visit, the one I hadn't been able to name. "What question?" I said. "Whether you treat everyone the same way because you can't see the difference," she said, "or because you choose not to act on it." I thought about that. "Those aren't mutually exclusive," I said. "No," she said. "They're not." Another pause. "But they're also not the same thing." I looked at her. She looked back. We were, I decided, definitely talking about something else. "I can't see the P," I said. "But I know what it means. I looked it up after the notification. I understood what I'd missed." "And if you had seen it," she said, "that first day, what would you have done differently?" I thought about it honestly, which meant thinking about it for longer than a quick answer required. "I would have been more formal," I said. "I would have used different language. I might have offered a different waiting area." I stopped. I wouldn't have asked if she needed a chair. She was quiet. "I don't mean that as a criticism of the protocol," I said. "I mean that some things I do automatically and some things I do deliberately, and that one was automatic." I saw someone who looked tired. I offered a chair. "Vela," she said. "I know her name now," I said. "From the registry." She mentioned the chair. She said. "Later. That evening." I didn't say anything. "She has been with my..." She stopped. Adjusted. "She has been working in the same role for 22 years. She mentioned the chair because it surprised her." Another pause. "She doesn't usually mention things." I finished the notes. Capped my pen. The supply cabinet needed restocking again. It always needed restocking. The inventory system was constitutionally optimistic, but I didn't move to do it. 22 years is a long time," I said. "Yes," she said. "It is." We were talking about Vela. We were also, I was fairly certain, talking about what it means when someone has been in a room for 22 years and the first time a stranger asks if they need to sit down it's worth mentioning. I didn't know enough to say what it meant precisely. I knew it meant something. "The follow-up looks good," I said. "One more check in a week should close out the case." "I'll return in a week," she said. She left. Vela walked out behind her, and I watched the door for a moment after it closed the way you watch a door when you're not sure what just happened but you know something did. I restocked the supply cabinet. I thought about the question she'd asked, what would you have done differently? And about my answer, which had been honest and which I stood by and which had also, I realized, told her something I hadn't planned to tell her. That I knew the difference. I just didn't always think the difference was the most important thing. I wasn't sure if that was going to be a problem. It turned out it wasn't. It turned out it was the opposite of a problem, though I didn't know that yet, and the knowing took longer than a week. The next appointment was in 7 days. I put it in the calendar and went back to work and thought about other things successfully for approximately 2 hours before I stopped thinking about other things and started thinking about a question that didn't have a clean answer. Whether it matters more what you can see or what you choose to do with what you see. I didn't resolve it. Some questions you carry rather than answer. I carried it to the end of the shift and home and to sleep, and when I woke up the next morning it was still there, which is usually how I know a question is actually worth asking. The third visit was different from the first two in a way I noticed but couldn't immediately explain. The wound was nearly healed. I confirmed this in about 4 minutes, which left an unusual amount of time in an appointment that had been scheduled for 15. She didn't move to leave. I didn't move to close out the file. We both stayed where we were in the way people stay when there's an unspoken agreement that the official reason for being somewhere has expired and the actual reason hasn't. 1 more week and the scar tissue will have stabilized, I said. After that there's nothing further to monitor. I see, she said. You've healed well. Good tissue response. Thank you. We were talking about wound healing. We both knew we were doing it deliberately, as a kind of holding pattern, and the awareness of that was its own conversation happening underneath. Vela was sitting this time. Not standing by the entrance, actually sitting in the chair I'd offered 2 visits ago, which she now apparently considered hers by established precedent. She had something in her hands, a small device she was working on, not looking at us, just present. She sits now, I said low enough that it was probably just to myself. She does, my patient said. Since the second visit. Good, I said. She also told me you remembered her name. I looked it up, I said. After the notification. I looked up everyone in the diplomatic registry who had been in the station that day. Why? I thought about how to answer that accurately. Because I'd interacted with people without knowing who they were and I preferred to know. Even after the fact. Especially after the fact. I said. Retroactive information is still information. She looked at me. What else did you learn from the registry? Enough. I said. A pause. Enough to know who I am. Yes. And you haven't changed how you speak to me. Should I have? I said. We were talking about professional conduct and registry records. We were not talking about professional conduct and registry records. Most people do, she said. When they learn. They become. She paused, selecting the word carefully. Managed. I've noticed that about managed interactions, I said. They're less useful. For the work, she said. For most things, I said. She was quiet for a moment. Outside the small window above the supply cabinet, the station's lighting was cycling toward the afternoon setting, the slow shift from morning white to the warmer tone that the designers apparently thought was calming. I'd always found it slightly unconvincing, like a set trying to do what a window does naturally. The station, she said. How long is your posting here? 4 months total, I said. I've been here 6 weeks. 10 weeks remaining. Yes. And after? The next posting, I said. I haven't confirmed where yet. She nodded. Not the diplomatic nod, a smaller one, like she was filing something. The outbreak last year, she said. On the outer stations. The field medic response. I looked at her. I was on one of those stations. I know, she said. I read the incident reports when I was reviewing Varen Station's medical capacity before our arrival. Thorough, I said. It's necessary, she said. When you're responsible for other people's safety, you learn everything you can about the places they'll be. That's true, I said. Same principle, different application. She looked at me. You do the same thing. Read reports before a posting? Yes. Learn everything you can, she said. About the place and the people. It's how you avoid missing things, I said. Like not knowing that the person in front of you is. I stopped. Is what? She said. I looked at the healed wound on her arm. Then at her. Is someone whose clothing I should have been able to read, I said. If my eyes worked differently. And if they had, she said, we would have had a different first appointment. Yes, I said. And I would have left thinking you were courteous and professional. Probably, I said. And I would not have come back, she said. Except for the follow-up. I thought about that. And instead, she said, I came back 3 times and Vela has a chair. The afternoon light had finished its shift. The room had the warm-toned quality that I never fully believed but had stopped arguing with. I have a question, I said, that I've been not asking. Ask it, she said. The first visit, I said. The injury. Was it actually an accident, or did you come in because you wanted to see the facility before the delegation's medical assessment? She looked at me for a long moment. Both, she said. It was a real injury. And I wanted to see how the facility handled an unannounced patient. And how did we do? I said. You offered my aide a chair, she said. So. We looked at each other. I thought about retroactive information and what it changes and what it doesn't. I thought about a woman who had come in with a real injury and a second purpose and had apparently gotten a third thing she hadn't been looking for, though I didn't know what that third thing was exactly and was trying not to make assumptions. The case is clinically closed, I said. After today, there's no medical reason for further appointments. No, she said. If there were a non-medical reason, I said carefully, it would need a different administrative category. She looked at me. The evaluating expression, the one I'd been seeing since the first visit and had been learning the shape of. What category would you suggest? She said. We were talking about appointment scheduling. We were completely talking about appointment scheduling. I don't know the correct Villain administrative terminology, I said. You'd know better than I would. A pause that was slightly longer than the conversation required. I'll look into it, she said. Good, I said. She left. Vela stood from the chair and walked out behind her, and I noticed that she moved the way she'd been moving since the second visit, slightly more upright, the specific posture of someone who has been given something small and is carrying it carefully. I closed the clinical file. Opened a new one in the administrative system, left the category field blank, and thought about what I knew and what I was choosing to do with it. Outside, the station's afternoon continued in the way stations do, steady, functional, indifferent to what happened in the small rooms inside it. I restocked the supply cabinet. I thought about the next 10 weeks. I thought about them differently than I had that morning. The administrative category she found was diplomatic liaison consultation, a real category, apparently, used for medical professionals advising diplomatic missions on health-related matters for their specific postings. She sent the formal request through the station's official system with a reference number and everything. I looked at it for a while before accepting. Not because I was uncertain about accepting it. Because I wanted to understand what I was agreeing to, which is a habit I have that occasionally slows things down but has never yet resulted in a problem I didn't see coming. The category was legitimate. The request was legitimate. The reason behind both of those things was something else, and I knew it, and accepting it meant acknowledging that I knew it. I accepted it. The consultations happened twice a week, in a meeting room in the diplomatic section of the station that was significantly better appointed than my treatment room, actual chairs rather than examination stools, a table that didn't have a supply tray built into one end. Vela was usually present, working on something at the far end of the table. This had become the established format, and I'd stopped noting it as unusual after the third session. The consultations were genuinely useful, which surprised me slightly. I'd expected them to be a framework around something else, and they were, but they were also real. She asked substantive questions about the medical needs of her delegation, about station health resources, about outbreak protocols. She had read the incident reports from the outer station outbreak and had specific questions about response timelines that indicated she'd understood what she read. I answered all of it directly. She took notes. The response delay in the third station, she said in the fourth consultation. The report cited supply chain issues. But the underlying problem was earlier. The initial case identification was slow. Yes, I said. The presenting symptoms overlapped with two other conditions common in that region. The first two cases were misclassified. If they hadn't been 3 days faster containment, I said. Probably 20 fewer secondary cases. What would have caught it earlier? A medic who'd seen it before, I said. Or who'd read the literature from the last time it appeared, which was 40 years ago on a different station. You had read it, she said. I read everything I can find before a posting, I said. And I read backwards, not just current literature, historical case records too. Old outbreaks, old treatment failures, old things that worked once and got forgotten. She looked at me. Why historical? Because problems recur, I said. The context changes, the specific pathogen changes, but the patterns repeat. If you know what something looked like the last 3 times it appeared, you have a better chance of recognizing it the next time. That applies to things other than medicine, she said. Most principles do, I said. We were talking about epidemiology and historical medical records. We were also talking about something else, and I was getting better at tracking both conversations simultaneously. The patterns that repeat, she said. In your experience, what's the most common one? I thought about 9 years of field postings. People not asking for help until it's more complicated than it needed to be, I said. Across species, across injuries, across everything. The hesitation to say something is wrong while something is still manageable. Why do they hesitate? Different reasons for different people, I said. Some don't want to be a burden. Some don't trust that the help will actually help. Some have learned that asking costs more than managing alone. She was quiet for a moment. Vela, at the far end of the table, had stopped working on whatever she was working on. That last one? S said. Yes, I said. That's learned, she said. Not innate. Usually, I said. Yes. Which means it can be unlearned. With the right conditions, I said. Yes. We were talking about patient behavior patterns. We were completely talking about patient behavior patterns. The 5th consultation was shorter than the others. She had a delegation meeting that ran long and arrived 20 minutes late, and we worked through the remaining time efficiently. At the end she said, without the usual transitional pause, the outer station outbreak. You stayed past your contracted posting. The situation wasn't resolved, I said. Your contract was. Yes. You stayed anyway. There were still patients, I said. Leaving didn't seem like the right call. She looked at me. You do that, she said. Stay when you could leave. I thought about how to answer that accurately. I stay when leaving seems like the wrong choice, I said. That's not the same as always staying. No, she said. It's more considered. I'd hoped so, I said. Staying automatically isn't virtue, it's just inertia. Something moved across her face, not the evaluating expression, something different. I filed it and moved on. Vela, she said, and it was clearly a different direction, has started taking meal breaks. I looked up from my notes. That's good. She didn't used to, she said. She would work through them. Lot of people do that, I said. It catches up with you, she said. She paused. She said that a person she had met reminded her that rest was permitted. I thought about a chair by a waiting room entrance and the careful way someone had sat down in it. I'm glad, I said. It's a simple thing. Simple things are sometimes the ones that don't happen, she said. For a long time. Yes, I said. That's true. The consultation ended. I walked back to the medical wing through the station's main corridor, which was busy in the late afternoon way, people moving with purpose, the particular energy of a workday winding down. I thought about simple things that don't happen for a long time and what it takes to change that. I thought about the next 4 weeks. My posting ended in 4 weeks. I hadn't thought about that in a while. I'd been thinking about the consultations and the patients and the supply cabinet and the soup, and not about the fact that in 4 weeks I'd file my final report, pack my equipment, and move to the next posting, wherever that was. I sat with that for a while when I got back to my treatment room. The supply cabinet needed restocking. I did it mechanically, not paying much attention to what I was doing. I'd been at 6 postings. Left all of them. It was the nature of the work. You go where you're needed, you do the job, you go where you're needed next. It had never felt like leaving before, not exactly. It had felt like finishing and moving on. I thought about that distinction and what it meant that I was drawing it now when I hadn't before, and I didn't reach a conclusion, and I finished restocking the cabinet and locked up and went home. I did not think about 4 weeks. I thought about it constantly. The outbreak started on a Tuesday. I know this because Tuesday is when I do the weekly equipment calibration, and I was halfway through it when the first case came in. By the time I finished the calibration, which I did finish, because uncalibrated equipment during an outbreak is worse than no equipment, there were 4 cases, and by evening there were 11, and by the following morning the station's medical team had activated emergency protocols and I hadn't slept. The pathogen was new to me, which meant I went to the historical records immediately. Not current literature wouldn't have it yet. I pulled everything from the station's medical archive going back 60 years and started reading backward, the way I always do, looking for something that looked like what I was seeing. I found it on the 3rd search. 43 years ago, different station, similar presentation. The treatment protocol that had worked then was not the current standard approach. It had been superseded by a newer method that was more effective for the common variant, but less effective for the original strain. What was circulating on Varen's station looked like the original strain. I filed the protocol recommendation at 4 in the morning and went back to patients. She appeared at the medical wing entrance at 6. Not as a patient. She came in with Vela and 2 of her delegation staff and looked at the situation, the additional cots, the supply reorganization, the specific controlled chaos of a medical space under pressure, and said to me directly, "What do you need? What do you have?" I said, which was the practical answer. What she had was significant. Her delegation had brought a comprehensive medical supply cache as standard protocol for extended diplomatic missions, materials I didn't have and couldn't get through the station's supply chain in time to matter. She had staff with organizational capacity who could manage logistics so my team could focus on patients. She had, it turned out, a working knowledge of Elaine-specific medication interactions that was more current than what I had on file. "You know the pharmacology," I said the first time she corrected an interaction flag I'd missed. "My chief medical officer briefed me before every extended mission," she said. "In detail. I retain it. In case of exactly this," I said. "In case of something," she said. "You don't plan for the specific emergency. You build general capacity and apply it." I thought about reading historical medical records before every posting. "Same principle," I said. "Yes," she said. "Different application." We worked. That's the accurate description of the next 36 hours. We worked, and there is not much more to say about it than that. The decisions were medical and logistical and came quickly, and the space for anything that wasn't the work contracted to nothing, which is what happens in a genuine emergency, and which I've always found clarifying in a way that is hard to explain to people who haven't experienced it. What I can say about those 36 hours, beyond the clinical facts, is this: she worked the way she asked questions in the consultations, completely, without performance, making decisions and moving on. She didn't defer to me on medical questions I knew better, and I didn't defer to her on logistical questions she knew better. We divided the work the way water divides around an obstacle, not by agreement, just by finding the path that moved. Vela managed the supply coordination. She did it with the specific competence of someone who has been doing complex organizational work for 22 years and has never been given a task commensurate with that competence. I watched her work at one point, really watched, not peripheral awareness, and thought about 22 years and what it looks like when someone is finally in the right size job. At hour 29 I made an error. Not a catastrophic one, I caught it before it became anything. A dosage calculation for a pediatric patient, complicated by the species-specific weight-to-metabolism ratio, which I'd calculated correctly and then second-guessed myself on incorrectly. I caught the second guess before it reached the patient. Standard error management, the kind that happens when you've been awake for a long time and your brain starts doing things without full supervision. She was standing nearby when I caught it. I corrected it, noted it in the log the way errors get noted even when they don't reach patients, and kept moving. An hour later, during a brief gap between cases, she said, "The pediatric dosage. Caught before administration," I said. "Logged." "I know," she said. "I saw." I waited. "You logged it," she said. "Without being required to. For a near miss that had no outcome. That's how errors get prevented," I said. "You log near misses because they tell you where the system is fragile. If you only log actual errors, you're always learning after the damage is done." She was quiet for a moment. "In my work," she said carefully, "near misses are often not logged. Because logging them creates a record of almost failures. Which people find uncomfortable," I said. "Which people find politically inconvenient," she said. "So the fragilities don't get addressed," I said. "Until they become actual failures," she said. "Yes." We were talking about medical error logging practices. We were talking about something considerably larger than medical error logging practices, and we both knew it. "The historical records," I said. "The 43-year-old protocol. That's in the system because someone logged a near miss that looked different from the standard presentation and wrote it up anyway even though the case resolved." "I read that entry," she said. "When you cited it in the protocol recommendation. Whoever wrote it probably thought it was a minor documentation detail," I said. 43 years later, it's why the cases here are responding to treatment." She looked at me for a moment with an expression I'd been seeing more of lately. Not the evaluating one from the early visits, something that had replaced it. I still didn't have a complete name for it. "You think about things in very long time frames," she said. "Medical history teaches you to," I said. "Problems recur. Solutions get forgotten. Someone has to keep the record." "Yes," she said. And then, quieter, "Someone does." The gap closed and we went back to patients, and I didn't think about anything except the work for the next 6 hours, which is what the work requires and what I gave it. At hour 36 the outbreak was contained. Not resolved, that would take another week, but the acute phase was over, the treatment protocol was working, the patient census had stopped climbing. I sat down for the first time in a day and a half on a supply crate in the equipment corridor and stared at the wall. She found me there 20 minutes later. She sat down on the supply crate beside mine, which left approximately 30 centimeters between us. She didn't say anything. Neither did I. We sat in the equipment corridor while the station hummed around us doing what stations do. After a while she said, 3 weeks. "Until my posting ends," I said. "Yes. You haven't confirmed the next posting." I looked at her. "How do you know that?" "I asked the station administrative office about contractor renewal timelines," she said. In the context of the outbreak response and whether your contract might be extended. That's a reasonable thing to ask, I said. It was also, she said carefully, a way of finding out whether you had somewhere to be after this. We were sitting on supply crates in an equipment corridor at the end of a 36-hour emergency. We were talking about contract administration. I don't, I said, have somewhere to be after this. She looked straight ahead at the wall across from us. I'll be at Varon Station for another 6 weeks, she said, after your posting ends. I know, I said. The diplomatic mission timeline is in the station registry. You read the registry, she said. Retroactive information is still information, I said. A pause. There is a category, she said, in the diplomatic administrative system for extended medical consultancy. Longer term than the current arrangement. How much longer? I said. That would depend on the scope of the consultation, she said. It's flexible. We were talking about administrative categories and contract structures. We were sitting 30 centimeters apart on supply crates after 36 hours of working side by side through something that had required everything both of us had, and we were talking about administrative categories. I need to review the terms, I said. Of course, she said. And confirm availability, I said. Naturally, she said. Neither of us moved. I'll look at it tomorrow, I said. When I've slept. That seems reasonable, she said. We sat there for another few minutes, not talking, while the station continued around us. Eventually she stood, and I stood, and we went in separate directions toward whatever came next. I slept for 9 hours. In the morning the extended consultancy terms were in my administrative inbox, sent at some point during the night. I read them twice. They were exactly what she described, flexible, legitimate, well-structured. I accepted before I finished the second read. 3 weeks later I packed my personal equipment, filed my final posting report, and did not leave. The extended consultancy began the following Monday. Same meeting room, same twice-weekly schedule, different administrative category. Vela brought tea the first session, which she hadn't done before, and set a cup in front of me without asking if I wanted it. I drank it. It was good. The work continued, real work, the kind that mattered. I reviewed the outbreak response documentation and identified 3 systemic gaps in the station's medical protocols. She read every recommendation and acted on 2 of them within the week. The third required council approval, which she was navigating through channels I didn't have visibility into, and had stopped asking about because she would tell me when there was something to tell. One afternoon, 6 weeks in, Vela set the tea down and left the room entirely rather than working at the far end of the table. Neither of us commented on this. In the silence after the door closed, S said, without preamble. The color vision deficiency. You filed the medical disclosure at every posting. Yes, I said. You've been filing it for 9 years. Since my second posting, I said. The first one I forgot. I added it to my standard pre-posting checklist after that. What made you add it? She said. I thought about my second posting. A formal reception I'd attended as the station medic on call. A very senior official whose greeting I'd apparently failed to acknowledge correctly because I hadn't recognized the color of his sash. I caused a small diplomatic incident, I said. Nothing serious. But I understood after that the information was relevant to disclose. She looked at me. So the disclosure that brought you to my attention, she said, exists because of an incident 9 years ago at a different station. Yes, I said. And if you had never caused that incident, she said slowly, you would not have filed the disclosure. And I would have left the first appointment thinking you were rude. And none of this would have happened. We sat with that. A 9-year-old administrative habit, she said quietly. Changed everything, I said. She looked at her hands on the table. Then at me. I'm glad you forgot, she said. That first time. Outside, the station continued its work. Vela was somewhere doing something useful. The tea was warm. I was still there. So was she.